I'll be speaking with architectural historian and former mayor of Accra, Osagyefo, and we'll be tracing the formative periods of modernism in Ghana in the 1960s, while pondering the inextricable relationship and resonance that these two significant periods in time had to one another. Uncle Nat, it's a pleasure to have you here with us once again.
Thank you very much, Akushka.
So, we'll get right into it. The subject is modernism and independence. And we'll start with the sequence of events that led to the adoption and adaptation of modernism in Ghana.
Okay. Modernism is a worldwide phenomenon. It has roots in many countries, principally from Germany, Middle Europe, between the two world wars. And the legend has it that a group of young European artists, writers, intellectuals surveyed the havoc that the First World War had caused and were very much aware of the role that politicians had put the culture of their people into jeopardy by weaponizing it. So, at the end of the First World War and in between the two world wars, there grew a feeling among European artists and architects and intellectuals that never again should they allow themselves and their works to be used like that. You found this in music, you found this in theater, and certainly you found it in architecture, because the works of the architects to a large extent was stamped by the character of the nation from which it emerged. So you had Italian architecture, German, etc., etc. It was also a period when the monarchic system in Europe was slowly being dismantled. And people's movements, as in democracy, on one hand, the Russian Revolution on the other, were dismantling the previous symbols of authority and replacing them. And many of the founders of modern architecture felt that they had to do something about the way that architecture had been pushed by their political elite to represent values that they do not share. One of the methods was to strip architecture of much of the national symbolisms which identified particular national pieces of work. And also to give new meaning, because new techniques of construction were happening. Steel had come in and it changed the figuration of architecture. New materials were coming in and new ideas were coming in. And the ancient form of architecture represented a very hierarchical society. That was a period when a lot of Roman and Greek symbolism, which represents in Europe authority. And these were all the building styles before the war. So the new architects wanted to get away from that as much as possible. So the Bauhaus, of which you've heard, is established by Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, and other architects began. And their intention was to strip their profession, their art, of any extraneous national characteristics, reduce it to the most functional aspects of it. That's basically gave rise to the so-called international style of architecture, which we have all inherited. Now, when it came to Africa, the international style came to its own essentially after the Second World War, when Europe was once more devastated. And nationalism had arisen in Africa as a result of the events happening around the world. Russian Revolution had taken place and several other revolutions. And the old order was certainly being chased away. And the new African nationalists, the Osagyefo, the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Jomo Kenyattas, also saw that this is a time to reformulate the African cultural landscape. They were politicians, now, sure, but they also saw that without making some basic cultural changes, you would still carry the burden of the colonized mind. One of the areas in which certainly Nkrumah thought he could make this difference was in architecture. Of course, the difficulty he faced then was there were very few Ghanaian architects. Technology, the school, Kumasi, was basically established to produce engineers and architects for the new nation. And he was particularly interested in its formation because he was hoping it will give the nation a chance to cultivate its own ethos of architecture. So, the first lecturers were mainly Europeans. Luckily, a lot of young Europeans who had also fled the conflagration of the Second World War were quite happy to come and teach here. And they brought whole new ideas. Nkrumah was particularly interested in this new international style because he was very obsessed with the idea of sweeping away all the vestiges of colonial architecture. And in 1920s, we had a governor, Gordon Gagisberg, who was also radical in his own way. Because before the First World War, or right around that time, the idea that Africans could rule themselves was too bizarre. But when Gagisberg came to the governorship, he saw that the situation that we had could not continue. And he needed to train Africans who could run this country and take over. He did so by establishing certain institutions, amongst which was Achimota Secondary School, of course, Kolebu, and so other. Now, these institutions were important architecturally because it gave him the opportunity to build big projects in this country, using whatever talent he could find. Of course, don't forget he was still a British official.
Of course.
And so he had to live within certain canons. But he had established a blueprint. And it's kind of interesting when you look at his career, his impact in this country, and play it against Nkrumah's career and his impact on this country. Both of them were visionaries. Both of them had pretty extraordinary ideas of what Ghana's future could be. And both of them had the means, or believed they had the means, to start it off, which they did. And Guggisberg built Takoradi Harbor because he saw the economy moving away from just trade to the exploitation of resources, for which you needed a deep sea harbor. And Takoradi provided that harbor. So he moved the harbor over there. And of course, that meant that railroads had to be extended. The creation of Achimota opened Accra up to the north of the city. And building a railroads and hard-top roads had an impact of all the villages along the way. And then the buildings. For the first time, we had the use of stone, cement on campus. Of course, there were other secondary schools before, but Achimota was huge. So was Kodebu. So these all created conditions that led to this new international, to the exploitation of this international style. So after the war, when Nkrumah started agitating for independence, he appealed to the architects, the engineers, to help in reformulating the country's culture.
The local architects and engineers.
To help in reformulating the nation's culture. And they did what they could. All right. So when he came, he was particularly interested in creating new structures that could facilitate the emergence of a new national psyche. Of course, architecture, like I said, was one of the ways in which he did. But what he had available to him was the international style. It was not exactly the kind of Afrocentric architecture that he would have liked, but it at least had the benefit of not looking like a colonial inheritance.
It was a point of departure.
It's a point of departure, which he encouraged. So all around the ridge, Hollywood, the central business district, this new architectural style started to spring up, all thanks to Nkrumah's idea of reformulating Ghanaian culture. Of course, the one place where this is most in evidence is at Kumasi College of Technology. When you go there, the campus was really designed. Nkrumah also appealed to his friends in the Soviet Eastern Bloc. And they responded. And they sent a lot of architects and engineers, Yugoslavs, Hungarians, Czechs, to come. And when you go to Tech, a lot of the buildings there were designed by these Eastern European architects. Unfortunately, it fell foul of the Cold War. And Nkrumah's fall from grace meant that part of our history was literally expunged, ruled out. So very few people know. Here in Accra, the same group of Eastern European architects did the trade fair and the presidential stand at Osu. That was also their work, working through the PWD at that time.
This is the Public Works Department.
Yes. So that, in a nutshell, is a basis for what you just asked me.
I mean, it's very interesting that we begin to compare the periods of Guggisberg and Nkrumah. And almost in the understanding that modernism had already, like you said, permeated even pre-independence.
Yes.
And so you had schools like Wesley Girls High School, Infantsipim, all preceding the time of Nkrumah.
Sure.
Which is interesting. But the way you described Nkrumah's hold of modernism, that probably was more significant in the way he wanted to utilize this style to influence, like you said, a shifting ideology. What was the most important, would you say, piece of architecture within the Nkrumah time that captured a lot of the feeling of nationalism at the time?
It is difficult to say because there was so much happening.
Yeah.
And the conference center, or the Parliament House, a fairly important piece of work because it brought together many of the ideas of the international style. Even had on top of it that corrugated structure. So that was fairly quite important. And a lot of ideas were expressed in there, which filtered into the rest of the architectural vocabulary of the country. But then Nkrumah also tried to his hand at mass housing. And of course, Tema gave him the opportunity to do as much of that as possible, as well as Kolegono and Kadeshi, where you have the first mass housing efforts that he championed. The buildings there are far more modest and rarely come up in discussions of contemporary architecture because they don't look very heroic. But if you look at them, it was an attempt to synthesize African compound living style with modernity. Of course, now they could use cement, they could use aluminum sheets for roofing, they could make it. But they sort of maintained the central nuclear family and then had room around it for expansion. Just like if you went to Jamestown, the old Accra areas, how the Ghans built their compounds. So those are also very important.
Of course, it was important for Nkrumah to see that Ghanaian people accepted and adopted this style. Do you think? Was it important for the sense of belonging, seeing...
Well, when you do these things, you are hoping that you are giving people an identity. This is ours. Don't forget that the whole idea of the Bauhaus was to get away from a certain kind of European identity stamp. But nature abhors the vacuum. And if you take something away, you got to replace it with something else. Sure. So Nkrumah was certainly hoping, I believe, that by creating this new style, he can get people to buy into it and gradually leave behind their own parochial sense of what they belong to. There were other pressures. It cost money. to buy cement to build concrete. And the economy was not strong enough to support it unilaterally, universally. So you still have a lot of shanty towns, kiosks, which are proliferating and which houses the vast majority of our people. So was it successful? Among the middle classes, he gained quite a bit of success. Among the working mass of people, his success was limited, but it's not, I don't really believe it was limited because they did not see what the intention was. It was that simply that it cost money.
And of course, Nkrumah had very little time within his reign
to do this yet.
The 1960s are sometimes described, or are best described, as the year of Africa, especially the 1960s. For a lot of other African nations, there was this surge of independent states rising. And it's just very interesting the way modernism seemed to be that rising charge for a lot of other nations.
Well, because if you recall, before independence, there was a big push for a cultural independence, a cultural reformation. The Europeans had managed to rule this continent on the idea that their culture was superior, and they were here to civilize the natives. And they created institutions to stamp this idea into everybody's mind. So that generation of politicians who tried to overthrow the colonial system were fighting on the political as well as the cultural level. They realized that in order to be successful, they would have to convince their own people that they are just as good. Hence, all of them were very interested in what options, what alternatives they had, which was not clearly stamped with the British crown or the French tricolor. That's why you see so much.
And we're going to get to that, the way the architects behind some of these pieces of architecture even came from British.
Of course, because that was also in the 60s when Britain had gone through a devastating war. Even though ostensibly she won the war, whatever winning means, a lot of its institutions were devastated. And many young people were questioning what it is that they gave their lives up for. Don't forget that the same thing was happening in music, rock and roll, the Beatles. These were all a whole new generation of self-expression. So it's not surprising that it happened also in architecture. And these young people found they could come to West Africa and get a reception that they probably may not have gotten back home.
One of the most interesting being Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, who actually worked here before that period of independence.
Yes, but then they came very aware of the currents of architecture happening in Europe. And they also saw that the colonial style architecture we had was inappropriate for this place, and were determined to do something different. And you could see it in much of their works.
Yes. Yeah. You had expressions like the Ghana National Museum, which they...
Yes, museum with the date, of course.
With Henry Laston. And for the collaborations that were encouraged between foreign and Ghanaian architects, what were the exchanges, the influences like on young Ghanaian architects here at the time? Did this also influence their own modernist expression?
Well, it did influence it because they saw it. It's what they were now seeing. And don't forget that new movements in architecture don't care only on the drawing board. It also occurs on the field. You must have masons who know how to turn out these buildings. You must have technicians who are capable of turning out these buildings. And so at the time that these architects were bringing in these new ideas, masons were also being trained to build them. So it came together. It wasn't all plain sailing because there are a lot of holdouts, people who prefer the old ways. But at least a new light was shining.
The visual forms and features that defined the late colonial style, the way they responded to the tropics and to the issues of sanitation and health and just protection for their own, citizens. Modernism also had to adapt here and respond to the same climatic conditions. What were the sort of forms or features that then gave way to this new dialects in modernist language?
Well, modernism was very adaptive because it essentially tried to do less is more, which was their mantra. Try to strip everything down to its basic functional vocabulary. And it was quite obvious that sanitation was a big deal. The whole colonial adventure really began. One of the principal ideas behind it was sanitation. When the Europeans came here, of course, in the first 200 years, they were just merchants. Life was brutally short because there was sickness all over. Diseases they had no control over, that they didn't understand. Until the end of this century, when they really went into high gear of expansion, all right, and kept encountering all these diseases. And by the First World War, the idea of public health was slowly gaining ground. And public health meaning that you just don't treat the individual, you have to treat the community from which the individual emerges. So you can give somebody chloroquine to cure his malaria, but if he lives in the malaria-infested neighborhood, you're not curing him. So that was also part of the understanding of architects that we are not only building for individual, we are building as part of a community, which essentially meant being cognizant of disease, how it is transmitted, how it's spread. Of course, we had RIDGE, which was the first instance of apartheid in this country, which was created specifically to separate Europeans from Africans. And it was established not only in Accra, but in most of the principal cities where Europeans resided in significant numbers. And because then they had realized that the community in which they lived had a lot to do with their longevity. And architects could not help but take note. Then, of course, also, as the British gained better control of the settlement, they started writing ordinances to control construction. You could no longer use thatch roof because that's where a lot of mosquitoes were incubated. It was also not safe for fire. The mud brick that we use in buildings was not substantive enough. So all these ordinances were slowly instituted between the 1890s and 1915. All these ordinances were put in and enforced. In 1908, there was a plague, the bubonic plague, sort of like our pandemic today. And this plague was here in Accra, and several people died, and it made the government even more conscious of the need to regulate the estate where people lived, the density of where people lived. So all these laws were also coming up. So it was not only in the building trade, but in other areas where communities cooperate to work together.
And so planning around that time was of major importance.
Planning was of major importance, yes.
They had several plans that developed within that time as well.
Sure. Osagyefo had his own development plan. Nkrumah, when he came, had its own development plan.
I wonder how modernism as a style suited the master planning, more urban, design-oriented architecture, or was it just symbolically individually, strategically placed, structures?
Well, government could not build for everybody. Government could certainly set up a master plan of where we would like to go. Government would have agencies to supervise the implementation of the master plan. And they will try as much as they can to implement it. Doesn't mean that they're always successful. But government is certainly have an interest. And to the extent that you have to go and get a permit before you build, they can, to a certain extent, guide the development of the building in the community. Of course, you and I know they're not always very successful, but the ideas were there.
Some would say that the marriage between modernism and independence was one of convenience for its sake alone. Like you said, Nkrumah wanted to use this style to champion a new awakening, a shifting in ideologies.
I won't say it's a marriage of convenience, but of necessity also. Nkrumah and his political colleagues at that time were faced with a nation that was potentially fractious and feeble and could have fallen apart. In your own life, you have seen this happen in Liberia. I certainly recall when it happened in Nigeria. We all know when it happened in the Ivory Coast.
Yes.
So we live in an area where the last 50 years has taught us how fragile what binds people together. So it's a wise leader who can look for ways to make people stick together.
And at the time, there were a lot of ethnic divisions and group divides.
There were.
How was modernism or the modernist architectural movement successful in sort of neutralizing all of these polarized?
That's a very difficult question. That's a very difficult question because when we talk about modernism, it's a style with certain basic vocabularies, but there are differences. If you go to Kumasi, they build these big houses for multiple families. In Accra, you rarely have that kind of structure. You have, the houses are more 1 story, 2 story, but not the huge.
The spread.
So these differences exist. I would find it difficult to argue how modernism helped the nation stick together, but I know that it was part of the glue. It was part of the glue. Correct.
Because you had cultures like Ashantis who are proud people, not willing to shed off their identity very easily, even in terms of their housing typologies. And so a lot of these, like you were saying, a lot of these expressions of architecture ended up in places like the schools, the big institutions, the grander pictures, and Accra certainly as the capital city. You saw a lot of these represent themselves. But I'm coming back to something that you said earlier about education and how those institutions became the entry point for some of these ideas, these new ideologies. And so it was very easy to see how the architecture for a campus like KNUST embraced a lot of the modernist styles and, the Great Hall, for instance, this point of convergence of people. Is this one of the visions that Nkrumah had for Ghanaian architects in sort of changing their understandings of how to design for, social functions?
I don't believe that Nkrumah was omnipotent. I do believe that he was far-seeing. But once he has set down the template, it was to the different professions to see how they could exploit it and take it and advance the ideas.
You see some examples in persons like Kenneth Scott.
Yes, Kenneth Scott was the old, real colonial type who believed in change and was willing to place his life onto it. So he was, so there is the Kenneth Scott.
But they are one of examples.
Yes, and we are lucky that he was such a genius. So we really got the best of his ability. Yes.
Elsewhere outside Accra, actually outside those two major cities, Accra and Kumasi, in places like Bolgatanga, and again, schools and libraries. You had the Bolgatanga library.
Sure, designed by a good friend of mine. Max Bond.
Wow.
I worked with him when I finished university in New York.
Wow.
Yes. And he was among the group of African Americans who came here to try and to help to make a difference. And he designed the Bolgatanga library. Yes.
Were these one of his first works?
Yes. And it was very much an iconic work of the whole international style movement.
Being African American himself and trying to find expression.
Being African American probably helped, but he was a good architect. He was a very good architect and saw an opportunity to use a language which will be welcomed here, and he did.
Did materiality in the end, play a major role in how modernist architecture continued after the 1960s?
Yeah, materiality does play a role because the building industry is not dominated by architects. They are the producers of materials, concrete, steel, etc., etc. And they have a huge say. Nkrumah, for a while, was fascinated by the use of mud brick and actually championed the manufacture of mud bricks. Of course, when we hear the word mud, our mind immediately goes to some kind of rural housing. But those of us who lived in Europe and America know that many of the houses in the major cities are essentially mud brick.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the color, you can see the size, okay? But they have developed a method of adhesion, they have developed a method of strengthening it, they have developed a method of putting it up. So these buildings have survived hundreds of years. So Nkrumah had that interest. But in order to be successful, you have to have the material producers on your side. They have to see the money. And we are in love with cement in this country.
No, but that's interesting. In the way in which you've said, modernism allowed for so much adoption and adaptation that even materiality could have been, brought on in a different sense, in a vernacular that was more, in context.
But then you've got to fight for it. You've got to have institutions that will stand up and put its money there. If you don't fight for it, you're not going to win it.
Certainly, Nkrumah did champion institutions. Was this just about the brief period of time he had?
As I said earlier, it's not only on the drawing board, but you also have to train the ancillary technologies that will make it work. And part of the reasons why these police were established was to create a pool of people who are trained in such vernacular construction. And the coup that toppled Nkrumah put an end to all that.
Very, very, very traumatic time. This break in the narrative that we'd started developing. And then throughout the period of overhauls in government, and so on and so forth, do we see a resurgence for modernist architecture in the present built environment language?
Right now, you use the word modernist as if it was immutable and unchanging. But it changed a long time ago.
Yes.
Postmodernism had happened. Legon is very postmodernist. I suppose tech was as close as we come to a modernist emporium. But Legon was different. All these pseudo-Chinese characteristics. It's a way of enlivening the modernist picture. Right now, we are desperately trying to find a way of mass housing. The numbers of kiosks on our streets and roadways testify to the failure of our policies. And we would have to find new ways of housing the poor and the masses. And it will not only be a government dictates, but also architects will have to come up with new solutions. And I don't know which direction to start, where it will take, but I certainly believe that somewhere the vocabulary of the modernist movement would have a say in it.
We haven't really touched on what some of these typical features of the tropical modernist style were like. Would you like to?
Sure. Essentially, what we have in abundance here is sunshine and an affable climate. Of course, once upon a time, we had tons of land. Now land has become a premium. But the modern tropical architecture leaned very much on structures which allowed us to make maximum use of sunshine and the air. Open ventilating windows that allow the air to breathe through. Placement of interior walls so as not to obstruct the air. Verandas around the building or in front where you can use as an extension of your living room. These are all the elements of tropical modernist architecture. And it's not dead. It simply has to be used in a way to allow for a more dense configuration.
One of the most interesting expressions I see in Old Accra still is the children's library and the way in which these screens, like you just said, play on the abundance of light we have, both in shading and, allowing in light. It's amazing.
But you see, don't forget, you also have to take into consideration that people have been indoctrinated with air conditioning. And as this pandemic has demonstrated, you can't be too comfortable with recycled air. At least the old modernist buildings, with their insistence on ventilating the structure, reduce the possibility that you'll be imbibing somebody's poisoned breath.
Because it was just constantly circulating externally.
Sure. Not foolproof, but certainly better than being encased in an air-conditioned space.
Ankona, thank you so much for this very fascinating look into...
You are welcome. I hope I answered your questions.
Every single one of them. Thank you.